Now comes springtime. Mrs. Meltzer's flowers were starting to come in, and Gregory was a little bit older, and Bud and I were in the living room, and we look out at the flower bed. Mrs. Meltzer's out there working, and we wave to her, and she turns and waves and smiles. And then she collapsed. She collapsed right there, and of course my Bud was right there, helping her up. She passed out. He carried her to the sidewalk and had her on his knee and her head up and was holding her like she was a baby. And I called for an ambulance. We followed the ambulance to the hospital. Bud right in the ambulance with Mrs. Meltzer, and I followed with the car with the baby. And Mrs. Meltzer went into the hospital, and she was admitted in the hospital, and we stayed by her side. So it was a while that she was in there, but she never had any company. Nobody came to see her. She was in a garden club, but most of those ladies were too old to drive. So she would get a lot of phone calls, but she wouldn't get any company. So what Bud and I did was we kind of rotated a schedule. We would make sure that we were there as much as possible, so our new adopted grandmother would not be alone. And she was always so happy to see us. And we thought we're going to bring our Mrs. Meltzer home, and she would continue being our lovely neighbor. And oh gosh, she spoiled my husband. She made him all kinds of pies and dinners. I mean, anything that a man would dream of, Mrs. Meltzer was lavished on my husband because she adored him. So it went on, and I was in there the one time, well, quite a few times, and Mrs. Meltzer enjoyed seeing the baby. Now, Gregory was just little, and he liked to be cradled and hugged. So, but Mrs. Meltzer sang a song in Russian, and she sang it each time that she held Gregory. And I wondered, what is the song that she's singing to him? Because it sounds spooky. It sounds almost eerie and odd. Not a typical baby lullaby, but it was in Russian. So I didn't know what it meant, but I figured I trust Mrs. Meltzer. She loves my Bud and I, and she loves the baby. And I'm going to play a little bit of it, and I put the link over on the side so that you can listen to it, but just listen to it now. Essentially, the first couple words is about a man looming outside her door. And the mother of this baby is afraid. And I will let you finish the rest of that. It's an eerie, sad lullaby. So I asked her what it was. She says, my grandmother sang it to me, and then my mother. She said, in Russia, they sang it to a lot of the babies in her family, and it was a prayer and a song to keep all the babies safe during the time when the Jewish people were being persecuted. So she sang that every visit to my baby Gregory. And Gregory, she loved Gregory. Gregory was so cute with his little blonde hair and his little puggy nose and round lips. And he would just look up at her, and her heart would absolutely melt. Well, we continued seeing Mrs. Meltzer as her only visitors. And then one day we were both in there, and Mrs. Meltzer was having trouble breathing. She was rasping. Her breath was short, and she says, Bud, come here, I have to tell you something. And he had to lean in very closely to hear Mrs. Meltzer speak. She says, Bud, I don't have any children. Ernie's dead, my husband, and I lost most of my family in Russia. Please, please, Bud, would you do the ceremonial shoveling of the soil at my gravesite? Jewish custom. It's a Jewish custom to do that. She said, I don't have anybody. The women in my garden club can't handle a shovel, and the rabbi's going to ask. And I said, oh, Mrs. Meltzer, you're not going to die. Just hang on there. So she says, well, Linda, she says, I think the good Lord's calling me. She reached up and she kissed Bud on the cheek, and she closed her eyes and she died.